Hi, welcome to Relish Books. Today I am at long last reviewing Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. So this book took me a while. Really, I was reading a chapter here and there for a few months because I had a really hard time getting into it. The first quarter was very difficult for me, very unappealing. I finally had to just buckle down and make an effort and just read through it. And once I did, it only took me a few days because I quickly got into it. This is supposed to be one of the best and most intellectually challenging novels that has ever been written. And so I'm just going to talk about it today and kind of give my opinion on whether that's true or not, and some things that I thought about it. It is a difficult book for sure, but it's also really gripping and really interesting. And I guess I'll just go ahead and say it right now. I think it is really, really good. It's a great book. Amazing. And I'm not pre-prejudiced because it's a classic or anything like that. If you've watched any of my videos, you know I'm always going to be honest about that. I actually feel like I had more of a negative prejudice going into it. I felt like maybe it was an overrated classic. The whole feel of it was very unappealing to me. The title was unappealing. I was really just reading it because it was on my list. Felt like I should. And it is an amazing book. So, anyway, the basic theory that kind of starts everything going is this idea that the main character has. I'm going to call him by his first name because all these Russian names are really difficult. And it's also, in a Russian novel, names are extra complicated because it seems like every character, I think it just must be a cultural thing, every character has 3 different names that they go by. 3 totally unconnected different names that people somehow just seem to know. I don't know how that works in their culture, but it's been that way in every Russian novel I've read. So it's something you just kind of have to accept and try to just figure out and get along with. Anyway, main character, Rodion, is a intellectual. He fancies himself brilliant. He's very poor. He comes from a time period where there's a lot of radical thinking, a lot of political activism, where coming up with theories is kind of a fad. And even though none of the theories are actually original, something that the book points out really over and over. Anyway, he comes up with this theory, which is basically just a different version of the ends justifying the means. He has the theory that in humanity, there are 2 classes of people, the ordinary and the extraordinary. And the ordinary are meant to just live their lives in obedience to the law, be good, upstanding people, to follow the law, to follow their consciences, and to just, go along, be obedient. Extraordinary people are the people for whom fate, I guess, has mapped out a path to greatness. And for them, they must follow this path by any means necessary. So if there's an obstacle, they are allowed to transgress the law, to transgress their conscience, to overcome the obstacle because they have a goal to meet. And so for them, crimes are not only acceptable, they are right and necessary. So this is his theory. And not surprisingly, the logical, the obvious problems with this theory immediately come into play. Because people who have these theories are naturally going to want to think that they are in that class of extraordinary people that they've dreamed up, so that whatever they do is justifiable. He's very poor. Something that I like about the novel, Tolstoy in particular wrote mostly about middle and upper class Russians. There's a lot of glamour and ballrooms, and we see the rich side of Russian society. This book takes place in the slums of St. Petersburg. We see the very most destitute and low parts of society. We see people of every kind and description, the scenes that we see just in the daily routes of these people are ones of horror and grotesqueness and filth. There are no balls or glamour in this book. And that's something that I appreciated about it. It's just this different perspective. But anyway, he is poor and he's angry at his situation. He wants great things. He doesn't want to work and wait for them. He wants great things right away because he is brilliant and he should have good things. So this leads him to commit crime. And then the whole book is him dealing with this crime and dealing with really, I think, 3 different forms of suffering, things that he's suffering from. He does not, in his conscious mind, he still believes in his theory. And so he doesn't think that he feels guilty for his crime. He doesn't think that he believes that he repents really or has done anything really wrong. But he is still suffering hugely from that. In his heart of hearts, he does know he's done wrong. So he's suffering just for the guilt of the crimes that he did. Secondly, he is suffering, and I think maybe suffering the most, or he thinks most of his suffering, is coming from the idea that he's not extraordinary after all. That's one of the biggest things that's bothering him. Because he keeps using the example of Napoleon. Obviously, in Russian society, Napoleon is more of a hero figure. And he thinks, well, if I had been like Napoleon, if I had been extraordinary, I wouldn't have even had to think to wonder whether I was extraordinary. I would have just known and would have just done it without hesitation, and I wouldn't have thought about it afterwards. It would have just been like one step on my way to greatness. Never would have thought about it. Therefore, since I did struggle in thinking about doing this crime, and since I struggle afterwards, I'm not extraordinary, and I'm just one of the ordinary, plain old ordinary people of society. And if I am a plain old person of society, then this was a crime for me. So this idea that he's not extraordinary, this character has a massive ego. He's very arrogant. So the idea that he's not extraordinary is tormenting him. And then thirdly, the thing that's really tormenting him is knowing deep down that his theory was never right in the first place. So he's really kind of struggling from these 3 different things that are all interconnected. Regular old guilt, which he denies because he's still holding on to his theory, and then fear that he was wrong about being brilliant, and knowing that it was all false in the first place. But then he just lives with this for days and days and days and days. Something that I think is the most difficult thing about the book, and what was the hardest thing for me at the beginning. You get plunged right into this at the beginning of the book. And those first chapters are really rough because it's so much introspection. For pages and pages and chapters, we just have this character stumbling around the city thinking. And that's all that's really happening. He goes, also it's just this miserable back and forth. You know, we know how our minds work. This book is a book about minds, and he's constantly trying to convince himself of one thing, convincing himself of another, trying to just forget everything. He has moments of huge emotion, moments when he feels like he has clarity. Just this constant surge of thought and emotion that he's going through alone as he's just wandering around. He's wandering around the city, and you feel like his mind is just completely wandering as well. Nothing's really happening. It's a really rough beginning, and I could see how it would turn people away from the book. If I hadn't been determined to read it, I probably would have quit after the first few chapters because they're really rough. But once it kind of gets into his dealings with the other characters, his mother and sister and his friend, this whole cast of people, is when it really gets interesting. I don't know if when I've read a book that was so heavy on dialogue, whether it's the dialogue between people or just the inner dialogue that's constantly happening. I would say probably 50% of this book, maybe more, happens inside somebody's thoughts or in just pages and pages of dialogue. These characters love to talk. I don't know if that's like a Russian culture thing as well, but pretty much every character, except the main guy, because a lot of the time he doesn't really want to talk that much. Sometimes he does too, but they'll just drop over to talk, and they'll just talk for pages and pages and pages. Somehow, though, it's incredibly interesting. Something that I love so much about this book, really, is I feel like at its heart, what it's addressing is this idea of all these super complicated intellectual and psychological theories and just simple, basic truths of life. And there's this contrast and kind of this feeling throughout all of it. Again, the author doesn't really ever say. Everything is just shown through his characters. But there's just this sense that all these arguments, all these theories, in the end mean nothing against just the very simple truths that we have. Something that I love to, the thing that I really love most about this author is he's dealing with so many opinions. He's dealing with political opinions, psychological opinions, moral opinions, and he does not insert himself. Dostoyevsky has the right to write about these things. He lived most of them. His life was as interesting or more interesting than anything that happens in this book. He was a political activist and writer and intellectual. He went to prison for it. He was almost shot by a firing squad. He was pardoned at the last second. He went to Siberia for like 4 years. And when he came back, he was hailed like as a radical activist hero, only for his excited fans to find out that he had changed his mind about his theories. And he experienced love. He also experienced massive amounts of guilt and repentance and regret. He had an affair with another woman while his wife was dying of tuberculosis, that he, experienced huge amounts of guilt from. Just a crazy life that really led to the writing of these books. But he doesn't shove what he thinks in our faces. I love so much. All these characters are his work. He created them. He set up the plot. He set up the circumstances to work perfectly for everything that he's trying to show and demonstrate in this novel. He sets up his stage. He puts his characters on it. He gets behind the curtain and he lets them do their thing. He's the Pua Master. He's controlling them with his strings from behind the curtain, and he doesn't stick his nose out from behind the curtain and speak over his characters. And he just stays in the background and lets things play out. I admire this so, so much, particularly in books where you're dealing with so much, just looking at all kinds of human nature, human tendency, thought patterns, all kinds of things. Authors are so tempted to insert themselves and just seem to be talking at you through their characters, telling you how to think and feel, and he doesn't do that. That's one of my biggest pet peeves in books. He does not do that. I don't fully know what all of his opinions were on everything he wrote about, and I love that. He had the presence of mind, the self-control to just let his book be what a book should be. Other authors could learn so much from him, like George Eliot. But anyway, so I respect him so much for that. He just lets things play out. We don't know exactly what all his opinions are. And so I think it's really left, which is the important thing and why I think this is so much more effective, because the reader is left to figure it out for themselves, as they ought. And I think what's really being demonstrated is that life is just about, it's not about all these super complex things. They happen, and people can get caught in the tangle of this, how do you say it? Systemized thought patterns. They can sound interesting, and I love debate. I love these characters matching their wits and having arguments for the sake of argument. That's super, super fun. And their passion is really fun. I loved reading those parts where they're expounding their theories. That was super enjoyable. But in the end, those things are just words. And in their hearts, the characters know it. Those things are not the really important things of life. And yet he handled these characters delicately. Something else about the author is that even though he changed and didn't stay a radical activist himself, but he maintained his friendships that he'd had with those people. And the way that he treats his characters is with respect, no matter their opinions. Even there's this one character in particular who's actually really funny because his opinions were so out there. He has the most possible radical ideas. He wants to do a commune, where men and women can just walk into each other's rooms and everybody's just equal, and he's all for married people. He thinks it's married people's rights and that they should take lovers, and true love means allowing your person to be with other people. He's just very, very far out there. And yet the character is still treated with, he comes off it's sort of a gentle mockery. We're supposed to see him as ridiculous. Other people see his theories as ridiculous. But he's sincere. And in his heart, he does still recognize and acknowledge basic principles of humanity. He's trying so hard to repudiate all that, but he can't fully. And he's a nice character. You enjoy him. And I love that about this book, because you could see and sympathize with every character. All different kinds of people. I loved Sonia's character, this young woman who sold herself, became a prostitute to save her destitute family. It's actually her stepmother's family. They're not even connected to her. And she sacrifices herself and ultimately becomes one of the main characters and one of the most influential characters. Normally, these characters who come across as having a strong inner righteousness, I don't usually like those in books. They're not usually well done. I really liked her. Her character was simple. It's a kind of character we've definitely seen in books before, but she felt real. And her character and character development was beautiful. There are just so many things I could talk about the book. Yeah, mostly it's really, really interesting. I think you could take all kinds of things from it. I think it would be super interesting to hear somebody talk about it who maybe agreed more with the main character's theory, because I'm sure there are people who do think that way. I think the book would be really interesting to hear discussed by someone who sympathized with the main character in that way, and what they would kind of make of the ending, which I'm not going to spoil, but just saying. And yeah, it's an amazing book. It is intellectually challenging, but I think at the heart of it, it's just standing up for simplicity and truth in a very, very hard world. Yeah, it's a really rough place. One of just the roughest settings I've ever read in a book, because usually there's some reprieve. We read things like Oliver Twist, which happens in the slums, but there's a country that he goes to, a safe place out in a nice area. That never happens in this book. We are in the slums all the time. Walking down the street, there's just people passed out drunk everywhere. All kinds of horrors. It's a really, really dark, and yet we see beauty shining through in the most unexpected places. So there's a lot more I probably meant to say, but I just really encourage you to read it, not as an intellectual challenge maybe, although it is really fun and interesting in that way, but just as a really great book. I highly recommend it, and I'm excited to read more by this author. This was the first book of his that I've read, and it's definitely tough. I'm gonna give it a break before I read more like this, because it is kind of exhausting, but very, very worthwhile. So if anybody has thoughts about this book, I would love to hear them. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.